I'd love to ask you first just about the style of the integrity of Joseph Chambers, because you have such a rigorous aesthetic that really immerses us in the character's headspace and process and every single action. Um, and it's very quiet and spare. But then you also have these occasional moments of stylization in this film. So I'd love to hear about your process in coming to that balance and what kind of that dichotomy means to you.
Yeah, I try as much as I can early on to start conversations with Peter, the sound designer, Albrechtchen, kind of. Normally I'll write a script, or at least this has been in the last couple collaborations with him, where I'm writing a script and I'm sending it to him, and we're beginning sound discussions before we even kind of go into production. And it's an interesting, for me anyways, mode of like work, because I'm trying to think about the sound as it relates in the scenes and in the blocking and so forth. It's like, okay, what, how long to hold a shot, for example. 30 seconds means a lot when there's no sound. It doesn't mean a lot when there is sound. So it's kind of an interesting kind of process that we started developing in Killing Two Lovers, and in this one it was pushed even further. In the case of Integrity of Joseph Chambers, we discussed a lot surrealism and this idea that Joe is kind of going into the woods and we have this relationship, and we talked a lot about like, how is the woods responding to this? This horrific event occurs, but forests themselves spend a lot of time witnessing that all the time. Animals are there surviving. So we began to discuss a lot about like, well, how would they feel about this? And like, well, animals are really doing this to survive. This is done out of, carelessness. And then what precedes is even worse. So we wanted to like think about that a lot stylistically. And so we started out very much wanting to root it in realism. And then quickly, kind of once he falls asleep in the deer stand, it's almost like we begin the surrealism, and it continues to kind of be pushed and grow. So from a stylistic standpoint, I try to think a lot about that as it relates to how we ended up shooting the movie and this need for these different type of scenes to exist. And then performance wise, I don't know, when you're shooting these smaller productions, like simple moves take like half hour. And when you're shooting in available light, dealing with the sun as your kind of collaborator, you have to be aware of that 30, especially in the winter, 30 minutes means a lot as it relates to how the sun moves. And then lastly, Clayne really likes, from a performance standpoint, to be able to live in the moment, and be able to like kind of feel and experience what's happening kind of at that scene specifically. And so as it relates to like what Oscar and I did, we try and kind of live, if we can live in these scenes and it's not too much, like I think often if it's not feeling arrogant or esoteric, can we just live in it in single shots to allow sun to be there and allow performance to be organic? So that's kind of the approach. And then that kind of third kind of thing, which is thinking about what Peter will do as it relates.
Even the surrealist stuff has that organic feel you just described, where it seems very true to whatever is going on in the character's head. And I really liked what you said about time too. It seems like not only logistically, but also in terms of how you're telling the story, that your use of sound or not can be a way to kind of compress or extend time in a given scene.
Yeah. And I was really excited about this film and this process. How in the Killing of Two Lovers, we were very much trying to get only at the emotional state of David, and this kind of slow kettle boiling aggressively over the kind of time of the movie. And in this context, we're not dealing with that same thing. We're very much dealing with like, what is this individual's perception of himself doing this kind of thing? So for me, for example, when we were experimenting, him climbing up into the deer stand, and then we began to think about this kind of crowd clapping, it was really like, oh, what are our experience? Like, what will the audience be like? Yep, like I have had that experience, not necessarily exact moment, but you can imagine any scenario. You follow a YouTube video and you're cooking a meal and it comes out like the YouTube video and you're like, yeah, right. And you have this internal audience, and we all have this internal audience that either like praises and encourages us, or is our enemy and just beats the living crap out of us in this experience. So we were really, with Peter and I, there was a lot of discussion of like, how can we communicate that so we as individuals that are viewing it, almost, it's not a leap for us to be with Joe and to think about like us in context to Joe. I did hope a lot with this, it being kind of a fable in many ways, that the audience would be like, if I were in the scenario, what would I do? What things would occur?
Definitely. And it was also just really startling and funny, that first one, because you have such a realist technique for the first, I don't know, 20 minutes or so of the movie, and then suddenly this comes out of left field.
Yeah. I had so my brother-in-law built houses by himself. And the house that he was working on at the time that I was having more kind of interactions with him, it was a 7,000 square foot home out in Santa Cruz Mountains, and he would spend weeks on end by himself. And then we met up and had lunch one time, my sister, him, and I, and he just started saying kind of all these things, and I was like, oh my gosh, you've spent like a week in your head, like you've had nobody else to talk to, and the result of it is all this inner dialogue. And that really was one of the things I thought a lot about as it related, even though Joe's not spending obviously long periods of time, but it was like how quickly that internal dialogue, once we get in the car and we're not around people, begins to like kick in. It's almost, we deal with it until we interact with people.
And do you think that internal dialogue is something you want to continue to delve into further in your future projects, or have you gotten to a point where this one is so close, maybe you want to distance yourself more or do something wider?
Yeah, I got sent a project that I didn't get, but it was like, it would have been the next step. Like it would have been this film next step as it relates to like what is going audio wise. The character loses hearing in one ear. And I was like, oh my gosh, if we, I was talking to Peter briefly and I was like, can you imagine being in a theater and if we all just cut the left channel and only everything comes out of the right channel for a while, how insane that would make the audience, and therefore allow them to understand the character significantly more. But the script that I'm working on, I mean, these scripts, Killing of Two Lovers and The Integrity of Joseph Chambers, to me have always been kind of paralleled in this idea of characters in desperation, trying to get obviously what they want, and then the results or the effect of those things. And we have David and Joe kind of in this environment. The film that I'm working on right now is, for me, in many ways almost like the third aspect of that, but instead of the partners being separated, they're together. So it's a husband and wife trying to achieve something. And I think that necessarily in many ways will remove the internal dialogue element of it. Even now, thinking a lot about how the sound design can inform the narrative and what happens with two individuals who are together, especially if you've been married for a long period of time, you begin to be like synchronized. And I think a lot about how John Williams, gave with the Star Wars trilogy, gave people their own theme. Like, Darth Vader is coming in before he does, Obi-Wan Kenobi is before he does. And so a lot of what I've been thinking about as relates to the next project is like, how can we use certain things to get at the husband's state of mind and the wife's state of mind. But it also is this idea of this third film in this kind of trilogy of kind of characters in desperation.
In the last two examples, masculinity and kind of the futility of fulfilling the traditional male roles, or even impotence, seem to factor in heavily. I'm curious why that's been a fixation, and maybe what conversation appeals to you in terms of that theme.
Yeah, I've always been, some of it has to, I grew up in California, and my dad is not a very aggressive human being, like in the as it relates to masculinity. I wouldn't say it, he worked on his cars but he did all this out of necessity because we were poor. He was a music teacher, we were poor, and all the things that he did were like providing for us. And then I got this job and moved to Utah, and it really was the first time I'd been around such elements of masculinity. I mean, hunting is here. I mean, most of the people in my neighborhood own weapons and have them in their houses, and it was this different, for me, it was this very different experience of being in this environment of what I would consider more masculine environment than I'd ever really been in. And then as I began to visit the rural areas of Utah, where they really do, like Kanash really is an hour from an hour and a half from a grocery store, like a serious grocery store, like a Costco or Walmart or any of those type of things. So they have to learn to be even more reliant on themselves. So I began to be very interested in the dialogue of masculinity as a result of it. And then, of course, it began to be part of the dialogue in our culture as well. And I wanted to, I went back and watched like Dirty Harry, and I watched Rambo. And if you watch both those movies now, like Rambo is really about a guy who has PTSD coming back from the Vietnam War, and all of his friends have died. I mean, the big monologue at the very end of that movie is Sylvester Stallone's character being like, everyone's dead. He's like in the police station crying because all of his friends are dead, and the general guy has to come in and try and get him out of there. And he was in many ways minding his own business. And even in Dirty Harry, the end kind of killing, he's very sad about and doesn't want to do. And I was like, okay, this is really interesting. These films are kind of the antithesis of American masculinity, but the first films weren't necessarily that. It's the follow-ups. It's like the sequels are just like drenched in this like toxic masculinity. I was like, oh, this is so interesting. So those things turned me on to want to explore it. In Killing Two Lovers, really, David's trying to like suppress it as much as he can. He's been raised in this environment to be very like tough, and he's been living this life he's happy with, and then this wrench is thrown in with his wife, who's growing as a human being, and so he's fighting, and the gun just lives, underneath his seat, and it's this kind of symbol that just is brooding there. And then I wanted to flip it in The Integrity of Joseph Chambers, where you have a not very masculine character, not who hasn't really been raised in this very masculine environment, moving there and then trying to embrace it. I mean, he holds the gun almost the entire movie, and it's not even his, it's borrowed. And he goes into these woods to like prove himself in an environment where nobody really cares. It's like when he meets Doug's like, hey, we can go another week, man. Like, if you just wait till next week and I can go with you. Like, no one's encouraging it, but he feels this need to kind of prove this thing. And I was excited about these parallels, and both obviously are dangerous. Like, and that's the elements of both prove the danger of this ideology. Masculinity, to me, in itself, or at least what we assign to it, like if you could build your own car, you built your own house, like those are things that we are standing up, for example. Those are things we assign the idea of masculine traits, but they aren't really. I know women who work on cars, I know women who build houses. We for some reason have assigned that idea as also being masculine. um and so it's not all negative, but the elements that are very negative and been very kind of prevalent in our history are these ideas that in many cases are embedded inside men, that in the end of the day no one really cares about. I mean, we can discuss, the Will Smith slap, and no one was like, oh, some people were like, oh, you stood up for Jada Pinkett, and it's like, come on, Jada Pinkett's strong enough to stand up for herself. It was a joke. It's like there was no one asked for the masculinity at the Oscars, and so often nobody is asking for that type of masculinity ever, but it still seems to be prevalent in our culture, and works its way into the raising of children.
That was a great answer to a pretty broad question.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sorry.
What and masculinity seems to also be a subset of other traditional aspects of humanity and society that you cover in some of your other work in the specifically kind of the Midwestern milieu, and like what you focus on in Last Days of August and some of your short film work. So I'm curious about your fixation with, I guess, kind of days gone by, things coming to an end, the end of small businesses, big businesses, old ways of life, the rapture that some of your characters anticipate.
Yeah, I mean, it's so in Utah specifically, and I think some of the recent work has to do with living in this region, which, like, what's weird about moving to Utah is like, okay, the United States government could fall tomorrow, and Utah itself as a state is set up to do pretty well. Like, most people have years to 2 years supply of food. The church organization here already has political structure to some degree because it's such a prominent force here. You have, like, if it falls down, they'll go to the church leaders and be, what are we going to do? They'll establish it. So there's this, like, structure in place already, and that has not been my experience growing up in California. And especially, I lived in Sacramento for quite a few years when the rolling blackouts were happening, and we would have these, like, periodic blackouts, and then people would loot, and I'd be like, guys, the lights are just off. Like, there's no need to like rob places just because the lights have gone down for like 2 hours. And so I know there's been this kind of shift, for me anyways, and then moving to an area that's more conservative. And so what I'm experiencing is this resistance to change in this state because of these strong kind of conservative values, but the change happening, right? It's happening anyways. It's like we as a society have to become more compassionate. And so I know that I'm contemplate. I know with, like, Last Days of August specifically, when we were out in Nebraska, that was really eye-opening for Rodrigo and I, because we were watching the decimation of small towns, and their fight to survive without, like one of the things this woman that owned a hardware store, who's not in the film, said was like, if you buy from, people buy from Amazon, and they do. She's like, but what happens is Amazon doesn't pay taxes in our town. So we aren't able to get those taxes. Well, those taxes pay for the local swimming pool, the soccer fields, like social services and so forth. So by buying from Amazon, you actually end up, and then when he talked to the mayor, he said they used to have $3 million in the city money, and now they have $1 million, and they're trying to have to learn how to manage that. So we're sitting in the middle of a town thinking, like, well, we order from Amazon, or online. If it's not Amazon, Rodrigo tries to not order from Amazon. He tries to go to businesses directly, but still it means no tax dollars. Still the impact is the same. And for me, I'm like, we haven't as a society stopped and thought about these impacts. They're just kind of happening, right? And so I think some of it is this, like, are we going to have a conversation about this at all? Or are we just going to let it continue to kind of go and then just deal with the repercussions? So I know I'm thinking a lot about that, because the impact, again, if you live on the coastal cities like I did growing up, you don't see the impact on the Midwest like that. You don't watch, like we were in a Tammy, who is in the film, talking about her daughter, who almost died of cancer. Like it's called the Village of Dicks. It's like not even big enough to be a city. There's 84 people who live there in that little area, and it most likely, as she says, because it's mainly old people, will not exist in the next coming, in the next 20 years. That town most likely will be gone. And then Sydney, Nebraska is about 40 minutes from there, and Cabela's just sold to like Bass, whatever the store. That was the main employer in Sydney, and they fired everyone that was working for Cabela's, and we're moving that to a new location. That's a town of like 30,000 people, and 15,000 jobs are almost lost. Like, it happened while we were there. So it's hard not to be like, oh, holy crap, these things have massive impacts and nobody talks about it, right? It's just happening. We're like, whoa. So I know a lot of my questions are me as a filmmaker, like, what's going on, and do we find value in preserving, in Joseph Chambers specifically, if I go back to it, the interaction at the end of the film between Joe and the sheriff, for me, is specifically talk about when people who when bad things happen, but who they are, what occurs after that is significantly different than a stranger. Let me just say that when they know you and you say things, they believe you. And interviewing a lot of the sheriffs in these surrounding small towns, like, and it's massive. I mean, it's massive, the impact. You could end up getting manslaughter and doing 1,000 hours of community service, or you could get 10 years in jail, and that person knowing you impacts that.
For the characters, it feels like they sense this looming cataclysm on like a global scale, but for the viewer, it feels very personal. So I'm kind of curious what your worldview is. Are you more cynical or hopeful? And telling these stories, I guess it must also evolve your worldview a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of research into it, and it's so all over the place as it relates to, when you start to dive into the theories. When I was initially exploring, like, okay, if apocalypse occurs, how does it occur? In Utah, for example, the strong belief system is, Jesus Christ coming back, and this like second coming is what occurs. In other regions, it's a lightning storm that shuts down all the power plants. Like, literally, it's this, like, it's from these sunbursts, basically kind of like these volcanoes on the sun that they explode and they send this energy our way. And that's one of those. Another is the economic collapse, which as we're watching gas prices and food prices like escalate right now, is one of the theories. I'm optimistic. Again, in one of my research, one of the researchers was watching this documentary series that Netflix had on preppers. And it was such a bad reality TV show. At the end of the interview, the little docs on the people, they would rate them on their survival skills. So based off of so-and-so, and they have a 6, a decent chance, but most likely will die. Well, one of the documentaries was on a community of like, it was about 20, 30 people that lived in the Midwest. And one of the things that was interesting is one of the women that I remember, she grew apples. So she had an apple orchard. Another one had a sheep farm. One of them raised bees. And they all of the neighbors had taken on jobs that if the economy and the world collapsed, each of them had a responsibility, and they would communally survive. They got a 0 because they had no weapons. They're gonna die. They have no weapons. And I was like, what are you talking about? So my optimism lies in community. And I think the survival of us, if apocalypse or anything occurs, is actually in the communal environment. Now, the pessimistic and scared side of me in doing this research was up in Idaho. There are all these militias, and I listened to an interview with one of the head of the militias and said, well, what are you guys going to do if a collapse happens? And he said, well, we have mapped out where all the Mormons are in our area, and we know that they have at least a year's supply of food. So our plan is just to attack each one of those homes and basically take all of their resources. That side of it makes me very scared and cynical, because I have met people who very much the apocalypse is where they believe they'll shine. They're living below the poverty line right now. They're very conservative. They kind of believe all the Fox News stuff. And it's like the second the apocalypse or whatever happens, it's like they believe their purpose is that life. Those people, they scare me.
Yeah, Jesus. That's very Joseph Chambers core, but to the extreme. Yeah, that I was interested in how you kind of farcically explore that particular sort of American male in Joseph Chambers, but it's almost like less of a threat just because he's so. I mean, no, it's not a threat. I mean, very very much not a threat. You see the full extent of how his ignorance like affects others, but I guess when we're talking about
Yeah.
militias and people with who are. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for me, it was like, so a lot of these preppers that I've met, they're very like, they're waiting for it. They're ready. Joe is like the scary, it's the people now who, it's almost like Chris Smith did a documentary called The Collapse, which the guy in there argues it's too late for any of us who think now we're going to start being concerned about, what's this eventual fall that's going to exist. And I thought a lot about that documentary. Joe is like it's too late. It's it's the careless nature. And those people are very dangerous. I mean, these type of people who do not spend the time learning cultures and understanding the things around them, but jump into the things that they think are real, like, again, Tess says, like, I thought we were going to grow a garden, which is like actually more sustainable and more efficient than hunting. And it's like, oh, no, I got to do I got to do this other thing that will make me, manly and make me like fit in with the local guys. Those people are very, very dangerous. And for me in making this film, it was very focusing on, this idea or this fable of like this man's need to like satisfy this masculinity, and the result of it is always awful. I mean, we see it repeatedly, not only in our individuals who we maybe know, but we see it in our government reaction to things. It's like, if we go back, I was just watching something that was referencing 9/11, right? Our response to 9/11 was toxic masculinity. It was 101. Like, we've lost 3,500 people. Let's go and let's just obliterate. I mean, we killed innocent women and children for the sake of justice. And it's like, why is this the response? Why is there not rational thinking? We immediately go into this testosterone driven self-destruction. And it's like very much what Joe does. It's like, dude, because what's more interesting, going out into the woods and with a rifle thinking you're going to kill something, or actually going to your front yard and tearing up the grass and putting in a garden. You know, it's like, it's more exciting to run around in the forest with the woods than it is to be hoeing and plowing and planting. You know, you're like, put a seed in the ground, you're like, all right, in a month I'll be able to, you know, reap the reward of my efforts there, as opposed to this fantasy, you know, fantastical idea that Joe has that he's going to come back with this 10-point buck and everyone's going to be like, wow. Right.
So you have previously worked with Clayne Crawford, and also you have co-directed a lot of work with Rodrigo Ojeda Beck.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what how do you know when someone is the right collaborator, and how do you end up having these repeat collaborators? Like, what does it take to lead you there?
Yeah, collaboration is really hard. Like it really is. When I was in graduate school, one of the things that was interesting is they were really iffy about me collaborating. And they didn't look on it highly, which surprised me, caught me off guard. I just didn't think about it. And what they really actually pushed was this idea of like, what would be the third idea then? You know, it's like, what are you bringing? What is the collaborator bringing? And then, because if it just looks like, you know, a Rodrigo Hedebeck film and you're working on it, then how is it your collaboration? And so anyways, that really kind of like impacted me, where I was like, oh, what are the things that we're bringing to the table? And that began to be really important for me to because a lot of times you just want to safeguard your idea, or you want to be headstrong about it. And it forced me early on with Rodrigo to be more open to like, okay, what are we thinking about or assessing about in these scenes? And the result of it for me is that idea: when is something better as a result of two people than one? And so that's Rodrigo and I early on in our collaboration. We made a film. Like our collaboration first started with Rod very much deep into sound design and me very much like deep into cinematography. And we kind of like came together on that. Let's make some short films. And I would shoot them and he would do all the sound work and all the sound design stuff on it. And then it merged really into both of us kind of working together in that way. And we still kept the roles in the sense of like, with the short films, normally I shot them and he would do the sound recording, but it would be very collaborative. I felt very collaborative in the sense that we were discussing the shots, we were discussing the sound. And so, and then when we got into the editing room, that's where things always got heated between him and I, because it's like, you know, and he was coming from like quick edits. He was doing a lot of experimental films with a lot of fast edits. And I was coming from, because it was mainly me doing these longer takes, which have been prevalent obviously in the last two films. But I found that like we you know, complemented each other, and that this third idea very much arose out of that collaboration. So for me, that's how I feel like, you know, collaborations are going well, is just like not necessarily if only your idea is coming across and the other person's helping you, then it's not collaborating. It's very much you just getting your will. So just don't bother. But in the context of collaboration, if new ideas can arise, that's why, like, for me, what's been so exciting about collaborating with Peter has been my understanding of sound and sound design only goes so far. But when I'm shooting specific scenes, I'm thinking about the idea of what potentially Peter could be doing here. So I'm holding shots. These last two films, like Killing to Lover specifically, was a very scary process for me, because I left all this room for sound design that if he didn't do what I had imagined, if his idea was very, very different, I was like, oh, they wouldn't work. You know, if David's sitting there eating an apple and there's nothing there, then I'm kind of like pushing duration for the sake of duration, which we see sometimes in films, right? You're like, cool, you held so long and I made it through 5 minutes of you just holding. And it's like, some people really praise it. And sometimes I really like it. And sometimes I think the the filmmaker is a jerk. So it's a lot of that, but I think it's these kind of ideas of coming that couldn't exist without the two people being involved, which is how a collaboration is working.
Peter Debruge's variety review of your film, he compares you to Kelly Reichardt, and I feel like there are also echoes of Sean Baker and Chloe Zhao in your style, and so I'm kind of curious what your which contemporaries do you draw inspiration from?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually obviously really honored to have a reference to Kelly Reichardt, because when I was Rodrigo and I's first film, Ella and the Astronaut, first short film, played in 2008, and we were at the Austin Film Festival, and Wendy and Lucy played there, and we got to see it, but then also got to talk to Jonathan, the writer, shortly after, and try and understand what they were doing together. And he was so generous to just let us like nerd, like, I'm like, I love Wendy and Lucy, it's great. Can I ask you like script pages? It was like, we really needed to like ask a lot of what they were doing together, and he was really generous, and that really helped and informed. Yeah, Sean Baker as well. I mean, Rodrigo knows Sean better than I do, but we met him way back. Our first feature together, 40 years from yesterday, he was a jury member at the LA Film Festival, so we got to talk and meet with him. Yeah, I mean, you're mentioning all what's consistent in everyone you're mentioning. I would say Tim Sutton as well, which is like, really had wanted to see Taurus, that was at Tribeca as well. What I take from every single one of them is that Joe Swanberg is very similar, though I make very different movies than he does. It's like, we're just gonna make movies. Like, we could either sit around and wait for Hollywood to eventually, hopefully, allow us to make a movie, or to be able to raise the necessary budget, or you can almost write in a way that allows you to make movies, and I constantly am waffling, like, I'd like to make a bigger movie with actual, budget and people getting paid what they need to get paid. At the same time, I get itchy where I'm just like, I mean, even right now, it's like, okay, do I write a film that we can make for 30 grand, or, and we shoot it in, September. It's like this waffle back and forth between wanting to have financiers and budgets and all those things, and then the need to make movies that say something, and know that movies that want to say something are going to live in smaller budgets. They just are, because they don't cast the widest net.
In that context, what do you want to see from the next generation of filmmakers or new filmmakers? What is there a balance that can be struck, or what do you hope indie filmmakers can do in face of that adversity?
Yeah, we just have to. I mean, I think the thing that's most critical is fighting for our place in the dialogue. I mean, cinema is so different. So I grew up in the art world. I did my graduate school at UC Davis, which is an art school. And it's such a different thing to be like, I was always so envious of my fellow painters that just sat in their studio and painted. And like, if the painting didn't work, they set it down and they put another canvas up and they painted it. And then they would have a body work. And sometimes I'd go in there and be like, man, for me to make that painting cost minimum $10,000, like 10,000 to $500,000 do I have to raise to be able to like present this idea I'm thinking about. But I think it's important that cinema continues to fight to have its place in the art world. I don't think every film has to be a social message movie, but I do think asking your audience to think about things and to change the way, or at least to be open to different ideas is one of the great powers of cinema. I mean, again, if I go back to Kelly Reichardt's Wendy and Lucy, for me, I was like, oh, this is a film with some aspects of social, messaging, dealing with poverty. But at the same time, I'm getting to spend time with the character and learning like about this person and life decisions that they've made. And I have been that poor, and I have almost driven up to the like Alaska was this like in these states of poverty. It's like, you can go up to Alaska and work in the fisheries and make enough money to like survive. And that was like this like safety net as I was poor. And even a guy I work with now did that. He worked up there. So it was like there's also just great storytelling. So what I hope and what I'm seeing from as I get to travel on the festival circuit, are people trying to tell stories in many ways. I mean, After Yang, for example, the brilliant movie, and it's like, yeah, he's taking the science fiction elements, but there is things being said there. I just saw Memoria finally came through, and I went and saw that. I was like, like these are all contemporary people saying very important things, and I think we in many ways need to fight for that to exist. I mean, I don't know if you saw James Gray's thing about cinema that's going around, and the importance of actually investing in smaller, like if we continue again, there's nothing wrong with these big blockbuster type movies, but if you don't make space for other things, it actually takes away from the dialogue, and it diminishes the ability to communicate. I mean, one of the things I said about the integrity of Joseph Chambers is like, I really want a conservative and a liberal to both sit in that movie theater and be like, this guy needs to not have a weapon. Like it's problematic on both ends. And I was like, if the film is successful, both could watch the film and agree that what Joe is doing is not the way it should be done. But what we're learning is it is what many of these people who are going out and just buying weapons, they are Joe. They are these really people that are very careless about culture. And that's dangerous in all types of facets,
Those who haven't seen the movie yet, skip over this question because it's about the ending. But I'm curious about how you left it sort of open-ended, and I can't help but feel kind of this sense of doom just in terms of the puzzle pieces you laid out. Like he borrowed the one black character's truck, and we're waiting to see if he's going to admit it to his like old buddy who's like the sheriff. And is it obviously that's something you're aware of, but how with the ambiguous ending did you want audiences to take away that scenario?
Yeah, I wanted to leave it ambiguous. I went down and interviewed a sheriff in this town called Fairview about what would occur. And that's I was talking about a little bit earlier, where I was like, is this guy going to jail? And he's like, not necessarily. And I was like, no. And he's like, well, it really depends. And I was like, yeah, but they wrestled and like, he buried the body and then digs it back up. And he's like, it depends on how honest he is with me. If he tells me everything that he's like, look, you can freak out. You can have these periods of irrational actions. He's like, if he tells me everything and I go out there and I look and everything he told me is what I'm looking at, then I know he's being honest. And that will come into consideration. And that's the difference between murder and manslaughter. And I was like, so then what do you do? And he says, oh, I write this report, and the report goes up to the district attorney in Utah, and they decide what to do. And I was like, does she even come down and like see the scene? He's like, no, she just reads what I wrote. And I was like, so you decide? He's like, I don't decide. And he was like, I do not decide at all. I just write a letter and they decide. And I was like, yeah, but what you write in the letter has major impact on the life of this person, right? And he's like, yeah, okay, sure. So there was all these like complicated aspects of what potentially would happen. But what the sheriff guaranteed was the impact on the town as it relates to Joe. And that's kind of why I wanted to leave it ambiguous as it relates to like, okay, what are all the implications? Like you said, Doug let him borrow his gun. He let him borrow his truck. What accountability will happen there? Doug's truck has this guy's blood all over it. Like, I'm like, does he sell that truck and has to buy a new one? You know, there's all these kind of variables. Those things, while interesting, and what I was more interested in is like, as you're kind of sitting there with Joe, you start to hear the world come back in. You know, you start to hear town, the sirens and things. It's like, what is guaranteed is that for the rest of the time they live in that town, whether he goes to jail, whether he gets manslaughter, he will have killed somebody. And that's what he'll be known for. And the impact on Tess, who's from there, will be massive. You know, it's like the family lineage of her name gets tainted because of this stupid action, which she warned him about in the beginning. So I wanted it to be more about that than like, because we get into so many other things as it relates to like, what does Joe end up saying? What does he, you know, those variables that like the biggest impact, not necessarily on Joe, but the biggest impact is like his life has changed forever, regardless of the outcome.
Hey, this is Eric from IONCINEMA.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.